Hello and welcome to the Week 7 recorded lecture for PSC 603 Budgeting and Fiscal Administration. This lecture was scheduled for February 28th, but is being recorded on March 14th of 2022 at the end to follow with spring break. And today we will be talking about the federal budget process. So we'll go to the next slide. This is primarily covered in Chapter 4 of your text. I'll cover some key concepts that are discussed in Chapter 4, and then we're going to use the example of the fiscal year 2022 federal budget, which was recently passed by Congress and signed into law by the President. I believe it's being signed into law this coming week, to kind of give you an idea about how the process works. As the author talks about extensively in the book, there, of course, is a lot of regulation that's been put in place, and there's been really a federal budget process now for about 100 years. It goes back, really, the annual federal budget goes back to 1921. But the reality is that when you look at how the budget is actually adopted and the process is actually in practice, it's a pretty broken process that is heavily impacted in many ways by political reality. So let's go ahead and get started. As we talked about, the federal budget is an annual process that goes since the 1970s, has been based on a fiscal year that starts October 1st and ends September 30th. Actually, I believe that started in the 80s, but it's explained so in the book. What is unique about what is important to understand about the federal budget process is that it is a process that's actually initiated by the president. One of the executive agencies under the president is the Office of Management and Budget, and they are responsible for preparing a budget recommendation, which is submitted to Congress. Now, Congress then has the power to basically draft budgets however they see fit, but it does start off with the initial recommendations that are made by the president. And then those recommendations are then transitioned into bills into appropriation bills, which are deliberated on and reviewed by various appropriation committees or committees of both branches of both sides of Congress, and are then brought forth to the full chambers of both the House and the Senate for approval. When the House and Senate work on the budget separately, so there is the likelihood that a budget or an appropriation bill, and these appropriation bills are primarily based on agencies or groups of agencies. So the budget is not designed to be adopted all in one package. It's split up and reviewed separately. When these bills are presented to Congress or passed by Congress, there's a likelihood that there's going to be a difference in the appropriation levels between what's passed in the House and passed in the Senate. At the end of the day, both bills have to be identical. So they go then through a process known as reconciliation. And reconciliation is where the House and the Senate, through conference committees, decides upon what is going to be approved appropriately and what is going to be agreed upon as the final number. Now, this continues throughout the course of the year. They talked about how the budget process in terms of preparation if it was done properly, could last about 18 months. But the reality is, for many years, in fact, as long as I can go back and remember, Congress has not passed a budget on time. They have not gotten appropriations done before October 1st. So as a result, they then have to adopt what are known as continuing resolutions, which continue the funding of government through the end of a fiscal year on going forward and fund it for various periods of time at the levels that were previously established in the previous fiscal year. These continuing resolutions may last just a couple of days, or they may last a couple of months. Also, there's another practice that occurs a lot due to the delayed process of getting budgets adopted due to politicization, and that is that a lot of times the Congress will simply put together and will stitch together the various appropriation bills and will create what's known as an omnibus legislation. This legislation, like the one that was just passed by the House and Senate late last week, is where a tremendous amount of these budgeted funds are put together. So what this means is that the budget at the federal level is not a It's not a very transparent process. For example, the omnibus legislation that was put before the House and Senate was over 2,700 pages in length. And it was a situation where the legislation was published one day and then was voted on the next day. Obviously, that's not enough time for members of either branch of the legislature to be able to actually look at the legislation and be able to vote on it knowingly with appropriate knowledge. But that's the way the process has gone on. When we look at the total adopted budget for fiscal year 2022, it is approximately $5.1 trillion. Now, this is what is on budget. In other words, what is actually in the budget that is being adopted on an annual basis. There is additional programs and operations of the federal government which are known as off budget, and this mainly has to do with entitlement spending, Social Security and other programs, and that equates to an additional $1.1 trillion. And that's talked about in the book, that you have the on-budget programs and you have your off-budget programs. And off-budget programs have to be funded as well, but they're not funded through the annual appropriation process. These are permanent programs that are funded through designated revenues or through designated approaches. So what I want to do now in the second half of our discussion is really take a look at spending at the federal level and talk a little bit about budget process. And I have a couple of charts that I want to show. The first chart gets into the distribution of what's known as on-budget federal spending, this funding that is budgeted for on an annual basis. I think in the book, it talks a lot about, the assumption that people make that a significant amount of federal spending goes to the Department of Defense. And that is true. It's the third largest share of on-budget federal spending, but as you can see, it only makes up 14.3% of total on-budget federal spending, at least the money that's used for military programs. There's an additional 1.4% down there below that's called other defense, which is for civil programs. The largest department that receives funding is the Department of Health and Human Services. They receive over 32%, and this covers programs like Medicaid and other social welfare programs. The second largest is the Department of Treasury at 18.3%. You may ask, well, why is the Department of Treasury so large? Well, the Department of Treasury is responsible for paying down federal debt, or just simply paying the interest on federal debt. We don't pay it down, we simply pay the interest. So if you look at that 18.3%, most of that is tied to paying the interest on the federal debt. So it gives you an idea of just how significant that interest is. And of course, when we realize that what the federal debt is now and the considerable size of the federal debt, tens of trillions of dollars, we realize that it is a significant cost, and that's an extremely low interest rate. So if interest rates go up here in the next couple of months or couple of years, as they're likely to, that share will grow significantly as a result. The next highest is the Department of Veterans Affairs at 5.7%, and this is understandable. Then you have the Department of Agriculture, which has large programs, including the food stamp program. And then you have the Department of Education. All the other departments that receive funding on budget receive less. None of them receive any more than close to 2.5% of total funding. And many, as you can see, actually receive less than 1%. So a significant share of the federal budget is consumed by a small number of departments, very important departments overall in terms of services provided at the federal level, but this chart does give you an idea of the distribution of your federal money with respect to how it is spent. To kind of look a little closer at defense spending, this chart here gives you an idea of the share of the total. This gives you an idea of the share of defense as it relates to the total federal on budget. And what you can see over time is that the amount that is spent on defense, and that's in blue, has, as a share of the total federal budget, has gone down significantly compared to non-defense expenditures. And a lot of that's tied both to the entitlement to various social programs that are operated by the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as interest on the federal debt. And as you can see, that share has grown significantly, while the share that's defense related has continued to grow. It is now below 20%. This does not mean that defense spending hasn't increased. Defense spending has continued to increase, and as you can see, there's been periods of time where it did go up. It went up, and the share went up in the 80s, It also went up a little bit during the during the 2000s, but it's also gone down. You can see that significant drop that we saw here in recent years is due to COVID funding and the fact and the role of COVID relief and other COVID related programs had, because almost all of that was non-defense related. And then we want to look at something else, and that is the share of on budget. That's the ratio of on budget to off budget. Going back to our discussion with respect to off budget, to this whole idea of on budget to off budget, it gives us an idea of the size and the scale of these off budget programs like entitlements. And as you can see, that ratio has gone down, which means that for every dollar, what this means is that the share, if the ratio goes down, that means that the off budget portion of the total budget is actually increasing. As you can see, it picked up during the 2008-2009 recession when there was a significant amount of federal money put out there in various programs that was done on budget. It was also, of course, increased. That share did go up that ratio did go up during COVID. But as you can see, it has dropped down to around a to kind of an average of $4 on budget for every dollar off budget. And the concern would be that the possibility that as entitlements its entitlement demand continues to grow with the aging of the population and other factors, that ratio could drop even further going forward. So what I want to do now is just kind of give you some additional feedback on the 2020 budget process. And the first numbers we're going to look at are from the Congressional Budget Office, which they're responsible for doing a lot of the analysis work on the federal budget. This gives you an idea that the Congressional Budget Office prepares these baseline budget projections, and this is based purely on what is established in law. So it's important to understand that this is not an economic look as much as it's a look at what the law calls for. And then obviously laws can change, but from the standpoint of the end or the beginning of various revenue programs, tax programs, or tax cuts, as well as the various multi-year authorizations, like those for transportation. And what you can see is that if we look at the total for revenues, like for example, in fiscal year 2022, they're expecting current revenues collected from various taxes and other fees of just under $4 trillion. But they're expecting, and as we talked about $5.1 trillion in outlays. So we have about $4 trillion in revenues, and then about $5.1 trillion in outlays or expenditures. And so what that means is that in reality, that means that results in a deficit. And that deficit is going to probably be close to $1.1 trillion this current year. Now, as you can see, it is significantly lower than what we saw in 20 and 21. And of course, 20 and 21 were heavily influenced by COVID spending, which was all deficit spending. This, of course, creates a challenge in that, obviously, as you can see, it increases the overall federal debt. And as you can see, the federal debt at the end of fiscal year 2022, in terms of debt held by the public, is about $23.5 trillion. You take into account those debts that are held by the Treasury Department, by the Federal Reserve and other ones, it gets closer to $30 trillion. And as you can see, that debt held by the public at $23.5 trillion is actually greater now than the gross domestic product, which is a total of about $23 trillion a year. And this is kind of one of those metrics that is used in trying to look at the overall affordability of federal debt from the standpoint of that usually for many nations, it is seen that overall federal debt, in terms of the net debt that we continue to carry and grow, needs to be at a level that is less than the overall size of the economy. And as you can see going forward, it's not going to, as you can see with the way gross domestic product, it's actually going to grow to a point where it's going to consistently be above that GDP level, which is why you're starting to hear some calls from some people in political office for trying to reduce the growth in spending to try to get it back down so that total debt can get back down below the 100% GDP level. But there's a lot of good information here on this website, and I'm going to share this link when I share the video. because there's some good information here to look at with respect to overall spending. So there's some good information here at this page, and overall, the Congressional Budget Office is a good site for finding information on the federal budget. Now let's talk about the appropriations or budgeting process for fiscal year 2022. So one of the things that does occur, and it talks about with the various pieces of legislation that are covered in Chapter 4, is that there have been attempts, and there is a process by which there's supposed to be controls and limits set on appropriation levels with respect to the budget. And as you can see, these authority allocations are set by the House and Senate early on in the process, and the goals, hopefully, they stick to them. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And what you can see overall is that you have what the president submits in the budget. And when the president submitted the budget for fiscal year 22, which was last spring, shortly after he took office, he proposed a budget, a budget for these agencies. This does not include some other agencies that are on budget. For these particular agencies, the total budget was about $1.52 trillion. Now, when you look at just this group, it makes it look like defense is a much larger portion. But this group does not include all of the various social, a lot of these social programs and other items that are included on budget. This is more looking at agency funding for other programs. So as you can see, this 1.5 trillion is part of that 5.1 trillion. That's the total on budget, but the total on budget is greater than this 1.5 trillion. You can see that the House, when they did their initial agents authority allocations, reduced it to 1.506, and the Senate reduced it further to 1.498. And while these are small numbers, when you look at it, when you compare them, that does have an impact on what can be funded, because a lot of work in budget balancing is dealing with marginal amounts of money, but they do have an effect on programs. It does have an effect on growth. Overall, still, if you were to take the lowest level, which was the Senate authorization, it's still $200 billion greater than what was enacted for fiscal year 21. This page here from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, which is a research and advocacy group, is a great website for budget information and provides a lot of information about appropriations processes, as well as various informations on how it goes through them. And as you can see, this schedule does give you an idea that there is work that's done by these appropriations committees, and they are done. But as you can also see, like for example, a lot of this work was done by the House, but the reality is that that does not necessarily mean that the Senate took action on it. And that's one of the challenges we run into, is that obviously when you have a bicameral legislature, you have to have action, and you have to have identical action in both branches of the legislature. And I refer to them as branches rather than houses, because always people get confused with the Senate being called a house of the legislative branch. But just to give you an idea, the information, let me go back to this. Like, for example, the House has taken all of these actions, but very little's been done on the Senate side with respect to these. And the reason why was because they just couldn't make it happen. And as a result, in fact, the budget resolution, which is usually the budget resolution sets those authorization limits that we talked about before. The budget resolution is typically done in the spring, and as you can see, these were not actually done until August. So they did not have budget resolutions in terms of what the authorized levels would be until August. Normally, it's supposed to be done a lot earlier in the year. And you can see as a result, they passed these various continuing resolutions that were done. And as you can see, they actually had two continuing resolutions. One was to actually increase the debt limit. That's a separate piece of legislation that has to do with the overall capacity of the federal debts, basically increasing the federal government's credit limit. you can see that there were two continuing resolutions. The first one they tried to do, these were done right at the end of the fiscal year in late September. The first one was attempted to include a debt limit. It passed the House, but it did not pass in the Senate. A subsequent resolution was done to without the debt limit, which passed both the House and Senate and was signed into law on the last day of the fiscal year. So this extended federal appropriations until December 3rd. And what's important about continuing resolution is that for many agencies within the federal government, it allows them to operate. Because just like in local government or in state government, unless there is legal authority to operate with or without funding, and there are agencies at the federal level that do have that are authorized to operate without annual funding appropriations. Without those authorizations, these agencies technically are not allowed to operate, which means they have to be shut down. And this is what we refer to as a government shutdown. You can see that another continuing resolution was passed to continue through February 18th, and that was passed in December. Another one was done by March 8th. And then there was the omnibus legislation, which was passed last Wednesday and Thursday, by both the House and Senate, and should be signed into law very soon. It should be signed into law on the 15th because the continuing resolution runs out on Tuesday, March 15th. So it has to be signed into law by the president by that date. This information is very good, and again, I will share a link to this. So this gives you an idea overall of the federal appropriations process. It's a topic that a lot of people in government like to focus on who teach this, but and it's very important because there are a lot of shared government resources, particularly grant and other types of assistance programs that are funded through this legislation. But the important thing to remember is that there's a lot of legal requirements that are simply just ignored by both the House and Senate in terms of how it's done. They follow it to the letter of the law, but they don't necessarily follow it with respect to the spirit of the law, and that does create a challenge. And as you can see, overall, it's not an effective process. There's been a lot of talk about finding ways to reform the budget process, but in reality, what it really takes is a serious look at how the politics of the process work, because you would think overall, particularly when both the House and the Senate are controlled by the same party as the president, that the appropriation of funds would be a lot easier. But we also have to remember that from the standpoint of the Senate, that there's, of course, the filibuster that can be put into place. There's a requirement of the cloture vote, which requires at least 60 votes out of 100 seats. There are not, that does require bipartisan support. Then in the case of this omnibus, they were able to get that. They got 68 votes, so they got more than that were necessary to achieve cloture. But there are a lot of challenges that these groups face with respect to what they're doing. So that's what I wanted to cover with respect to Chapter 4. Our next lecture, which will also be recorded, will be on chapters 8, 9, and 10 as we get into a discussion of revenues. And I look forward to sharing that here very soon. So thank you very much and take care.